Welcome to the Naked Photographer. Today we are in part 3 of our part 4 series on the basics of photographic exposure. Today we are looking at the aperture. The camera exposure is controlled by 3 different things: the sensitivity of your material, whether it be film or digital, the duration of light, which is controlled by the shutter speed, and then the third component is the intensity of light, controlled by the aperture. And by intensity, I mean how bright the light is that reaches the film or sensor. The aperture is a set of blades inside what's called an iris in your camera. Now typically it's either in a shutter, such as this large format lens, or in the lens on your digital and 35mm cameras. And you can think of it a lot like the pupil of your eye, such as when you are outside on a bright sunny day, your pupil will contract and block most of the bright light from getting to your retina. But then if you go inside of a dark room like a movie theater, then your pupil opens up and dilates to allow more light to pass through to the retina so that you can see in a dark room. And then you've experienced when you leave that movie theater, it takes some time for that contraction to reoccur, and you feel the intensity of the light striking your retina before that contraction happens. Similarly, cameras have an iris built in that can contract and dilate to control the amount of light passing through to the film or sensor. Now, unlike both film speed and shutter speeds covered in parts 1 and 2, the scale for stops is very different. Speaking of stops, the term comes from the ability to stop light from passing through. There used to be something called Waterhouse stops. Before mechanical irises were used, there would be a slot in the lens that you would push a thin piece of metal with a hole bored through it to control how much light came through. And these stopped the light from passing through the lens. They came up with a standard scale based on a little bit of mathematics and ratios. So for example, if you had a lens such as this with a focal length of 300 millimeters, so that is 300 millimeters from the center of the lens to your film, they would measure the diameter of the opening within the lens. And if that were also 300 millimeters, then you would have 300 divided by 300, and you would come up with a stop of 1. And it would be denoted f/1, f being focal length. If you reduced the diameter so that only half the amount of light came in, then you would divide that number and it would come up to f1.4, and that would stop the light, half the light from coming in. Then you would have f2, f2.8, f4, f5.6, f8, 11, 16, 22, 32, 45, and 64. Now most cameras do not go beyond f64. Some might go to 90, but it's very rare for a camera lens to do that. And in fact, most of the smaller cameras, such as digital and 35mm, will usually typically stop at f22, maybe f32, depending on the lens. But because of the smaller size camera, you may be able to have a lens that opens all the way up to 1.4. Larger cameras typically will stop at 5.6 as the largest opening, and f45 or 64 for the smallest opening, such as this. But aside from simply controlling the intensity of light, the brightness, creatively, it also controls what's called depth of field. When you focus your camera on a particular object, Depth of field controls how much stuff is in focus both behind and in front of the object you're photographing. So for example, if you are at a very large opening, like f5.6 on this camera, then I would have very shallow depth of field. If I were taking a portrait, then the person would be in focus, but the background and foreground would not be. And then if I stopped this down all the way to f64, it's a smaller opening, meaning less light coming in, but I have much increased depth of field. Now, not only is my subject matter in focus, but the background and foreground are in focus as well. So creatively, I could choose what aperture I wanted and then control the rest of my exposure with the other two means, duration and sensitivity. We'll look at that more in depth in part 4. With aperture, you need to decide what depth of field you want for your photograph, if that is the most important aspect. So let's take a look at some examples of how your aperture affects depth of field for your photograph. So as you can see, the aperture has quite an influence on the creative aspect of your photograph. So in part 4, we're going to look at how you put all three components together, aperture, shutter speed, and film speed, in order to get the correct exposure, but also the creative choices behind what you want your photograph to look like. So thank you for watching. Please like, comment, and subscribe, and stay tuned for part 4 of our 4-part series on the basic exposures for photographs.